Homeless veteran gave his only bread to hungry puppy. What happened next made everyone cry. The wind howled through the city streets, a relentless force that cut through the layers of tattered fabric wrapped around Jack's frail frame. He sat hunched against a damp brick wall, his back pressed against the cold stone, as if seeking warmth from something long since frozen. His boots, worn and riddled with holes, barely shielded his feet from the numbing pavement. His fingers, rough and calloused, were cracked from the biting winter air. He pulled his coat tighter around him, though it did little to fend off the cold. It wasn't always like this. Jack had once worn a uniform, standing tall and proud in a world where discipline and purpose shaped his days. He had served in the army for over a decade, fighting in places most civilians only heard about on the news. He had faced gunfire, explosions, and loss, yet nothing had prepared him for the silent war he would fight within himself when he returned home. He had been strong once, both in body and mind. Now his shoulders slumped under the weight of unseen burdens, his strength reduced to merely surviving another night. Jack exhaled slowly, watching his breath form a mist in the freezing air. Around him the city moved on, uncaring and indifferent. People rushed past him, some in expensive coats, some with families, others laughing into their phones as they made dinner plans. To them he was invisible, just another unfortunate soul blending into the scenery of hardship they chose not to acknowledge. He had once been like them. Before his world collapsed, he had a home, a family, and a future. But war changed him. The memories of his time in the military haunted him, resurfacing in the dead of night when the streets were at their quietest. Explosions, screams, and the faces of fallen brothers in arms lived permanently in his mind. The transition back to civilian life had been brutal. The nightmares never stopped. The anxiety never faded. At first, he tried to push through. He took a job at a factory, telling himself that discipline and routine would help. But the loud noises, the sudden clanging of metal, and the pressure of daily life made it unbearable. He drank to forget, to silence the ghosts that clawed at him, but alcohol only made things worse. Then came the arguments with his wife, the sleepless nights, the increasing isolation, the divorce. One day he lost his job. A month later, his landlord kicked him out when he couldn't pay rent. His friends stopped answering his calls. His family, what little of them remained, had already given up on him long before. And so he found himself here, alone, forgotten. Jack reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, crumpled paper cup, shaking it slightly. A few coins rattled inside, just enough for a cheap coffee or maybe a half-eaten sandwich from a gas station trash bin. He sighed, tucking it away, his stomach twisting in hunger. He had long since grown accustomed to going without food for days at a time. Some mornings he woke up so weak he could barely stand, his body screaming for sustenance. But hunger was nothing compared to the emptiness inside him, the feeling of being discarded by the very country he once fought to protect. A group of teenagers passed by, their conversation loud and carefree. Jack didn't even bother looking up. He had learned to avoid eye contact. People either ignored him or looked at him with pity, and neither felt good. He shifted, his muscles aching from sleeping on concrete, his body stiff from the cold. He wondered, not for the first time, if it would have been better if he had never come back from the war. The thought sent a familiar pang through his chest. Not today, he told himself. Just get through today. Jack pushed himself up, his joints protesting the movement. He knew he had to find something to eat, even if it meant digging through dumpsters again. The hunger gnawed at him, making it hard to think. Wrapping his coat tighter, he started down the alleyway, his boots scraping against the pavement. As he turned a corner near a row of overflowing garbage bins, a soft whimper caught his attention. He froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a cry of pain, of desperation. Jack followed the sound, his eyes scanning the dimly lit alley. At first he saw nothing but trash and shadows, but then beneath a broken wooden crate, he spotted a small, shivering bundle of fur. A puppy. Jack frowned, stepping closer. The tiny creature was malnourished, its ribs visible through its dirty fur. It was curled into a tight ball, too weak to move, its eyes barely open. Something twisted in Jack's chest. He had seen this look before, not in animals but in men. soldiers who had been wounded beyond repair, left behind on the battlefield, waiting for the end. The puppy let out another weak whimper, its tiny body trembling. Jack knelt down, his hunger momentarily forgotten. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned, to feel like the world had cast you aside. He knew what it meant to be cold, hungry, and alone. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the last piece of bread he had managed to scavenge earlier that day. It wasn't much, stale, hard, barely edible, but it was all he had. For a moment he hesitated, his stomach growled angrily, reminding him of his own suffering. But looking at the helpless creature, something deep inside him made the decision before he could reconsider. He broke the bread in half and extended his hand.
"Here, buddy."
He murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse.
"It's not much, but it's yours."
The puppy hesitated before sniffing the offering. Slowly, with what little strength it had left, it nibbled at the bread, its tiny tail wagging ever so slightly. Jack watched in silence, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. Jack watched as the tiny puppy devoured the last of the breadcrumbs in his palm, its frail body trembling with every bite. It was weak, far too weak, but it still had enough fight left in it to survive. He could see that. And for the first time in years, Jack saw a reflection of himself in something other than a cracked storefront window. The little dog had been abandoned, left to starve, shivering against the cold pavement, just like him. Jack sat back on the damp ground, his body aching from exhaustion. The puppy let out a soft whimper and nudged his fingers with its wet nose. It was a silent plea, not just for more food, but for comfort. With a sigh, Jack gently scooped up the fragile creature, cradling it against his chest. He could feel its bony ribs through the matted fur, its heartbeat fluttering like a nervous bird.
"You're a fighter."
Jack murmured, stroking its tiny head with a rough but careful touch.
"I know that look. I've seen it before."
His mind drifted back to the battlefield, to the face of a fellow soldier, Charlie. Charlie had been his best friend during deployment, the kind of man who could find humor even in the worst situations. He had saved Jack's life more than once, dragging him out of gunfire, covering his back during ambushes, cracking jokes to keep the fear at bay. Charlie had been a brother in arms, and Jack had sworn they would make it home together. But only one of them had. Jack swallowed hard. He didn't talk about Charlie. He barely thought about him anymore. It hurt too much. But now, holding the tiny, helpless puppy in his hands, something inside him softened.
"Charlie,"
he whispered.
"that's what I'll call you."
The puppy blinked up at him, as if approving of the name. Jack let out a shaky breath, pulling his coat open just enough to tuck the little dog inside. He was still cold and hungry, still exhausted beyond words, but something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Jack had someone to care for. That night, Jack curled up in the doorway of an old bookstore, shielding himself and Charlie from the harsh winter wind. He wrapped his arms around the tiny dog, sharing what little warmth his body could offer.
"Not much of a home,"
Jack muttered, staring at the dark sky above.
"but I guess you don't mind."
Charlie let out a soft sigh and nuzzled deeper into Jack's chest. Jack had spent years feeling invisible, drowning in the weight of his past. He had spent nights questioning why he was still alive when so many of his brothers hadn't made it. But now, with a fragile life depending on him, the darkness didn't feel quite as suffocating. He needed to find food, not just for himself, but for Charlie. He needed to keep moving, keep trying, because the puppy had no one else. Jack had seen men break under pressure. He had seen soldiers give up, but not Charlie, not the real Charlie, and not this little one either. And so, Jack wouldn't give up either. The next few days were some of the hardest Jack had faced. Finding food for himself had always been a struggle, but now he had another mouth to feed. Jack quickly learned that most shelters wouldn't let him inside with a dog, which meant the occasional warm meal he depended on was now out of reach. He wouldn't abandon Charlie, though. Not after he had already been abandoned once. Instead, Jack scoured the city, checking dumpsters behind restaurants, searching for anything remotely edible. Sometimes he got lucky, half-eaten sandwiches, scraps of meat, even a few discarded slices of pizza. Other nights he went to sleep hungry, letting Charlie eat whatever little food he found.
Don't look at me like that.
Jack muttered one evening when Charlie nudged a stale piece of bread toward him, as if offering to share.
I've gone longer without food than you have, buddy.
Charlie tilted his head, his eyes full of concern. Jack chuckled, shaking his head.
Fine, we'll split it.
The bond between them grew quickly. Jack talked to Charlie more than he had spoken to another human in years. The puppy listened, tilting his little head at all the right moments, letting out a soft bark when Jack paused too long, lost in thought. He told Charlie about the places he had been, the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost. He talked about the brothers who never made it home, about the dreams he used to have before the war stole them away. Charlie never judged. He never looked at Jack with pity. He simply curled up beside him every night, a small, warm reminder that Jack wasn't completely alone anymore. Life on the streets was merciless. Every morning was a battle just to get through the day. Jack had long since grown accustomed to the looks of disdain, indifference, or pity from strangers, but now there was something else. Curiosity. People noticed Charlie. Some would pause, watching as the little puppy trotted beside Jack, his tiny tail wagging despite the harsh environment. Children would tug on their parents' sleeves, pointing excitedly at the scruffy man with the puppy. Jack wasn't sure how to feel about the attention. He didn't like being watched. But then, something unexpected happened. A woman in a thick coat stopped beside him one morning, holding out a small plastic bag.
For the puppy,
She said, dropping it beside him before walking away. Jack hesitated before opening it. Inside, he found a can of dog food and a bottle of water. He stared after the woman, too shocked to call out a thank you. That evening, as Charlie devoured his first real meal in days, Jack realized something had changed. People had ignored him before, but now they saw Charlie, and through him, they started seeing Jack. More small acts of kindness followed. A store clerk left a small bowl of water near the entrance, pretending not to notice when Jack let Charlie drink from it. A man in a business suit dropped a sandwich on the bench beside Jack without saying a word. A young boy knelt down to pet Charlie, then handed Jack an apple from his lunch bag before running off. Jack didn't know what to make of it. He had spent so long believing no one cared. But now, because of this tiny, helpless puppy, strangers were starting to notice him again. And for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel invisible. Jack sat against the brick wall of an abandoned building, pulling his coat tighter around himself as the night's cold air crept into his bones. Beside him, Charlie lay curled up, his tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. The puppy had become his one constant companion, the only living thing that treated him as a person rather than an invisible ghost haunting the streets. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills and coins, just enough for a cheap sandwich from a nearby gas station. He had planned to save it for the morning, but the hunger clawing at his stomach made the decision for him.
Stay here, buddy.
He murmured, stroking Charlie's scruffy head before standing up. Charlie lifted his head sleepily, watching as Jack disappeared down the street. Jack moved quickly, navigating through dark alleys and empty sidewalks, avoiding the places where trouble lurked. He had learned to read the streets, to know which corners were safe and which were traps. He had seen enough fights, some between drunks, others between desperate men with nothing left to lose. He wanted no part of it. He reached the gas station, bought a cheap sandwich, and was halfway back to his spot when he heard it. Voices, loud, slurred, dangerous. Jack instinctively tensed. He knew that tone too well. He turned a corner and saw them. 3 men dressed in ragged layers, reeking of alcohol and bad intentions. They stood around Charlie, their laughter sharp and cruel.
Look at this mutt.
One of them sneered, nudging Charlie with his foot. Jack's breath caught in his throat as Charlie let out a growl, a tiny, fierce sound from a creature too small to back it up.
Get away from him.
Jack said, his voice low and steady. The men turned toward him, grinning.
Relax, old man.
The tallest one said, stepping forward.
Just having a little fun. Cute dog. Bet he gets you more pity money, huh?
Jack clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. Getting into a fight wasn't an option. He had learned long ago that violence only made things worse.
He's not for sale.
Jack muttered.
Leave him alone.
The leader scoffed.
What else you got then?
He eyed the plastic bag in Jack's hand.
That a sandwich?
Jack's grip tightened.
Come on, man.
Another one said, stepping closer.
We just want a bite. Ain't like you got much to lose anyway.
Jack felt his heart pound. The old instincts kicked in. The way his body braced for an attack. The way he scanned for exits, just like he had done in combat. But then the flashbacks came. Gunfire, screaming, the smell of blood and sweat. The world spun around him. He was no longer in the alley. He was back in the desert, his unit under fire. He could hear the desperate shouts of his comrades, the deafening sound of an explosion, the suffocating weight of dust and heat. He saw Charlie, the real Charlie, fall beside him, his body limp, his eyes staring into nothing. Jack froze. His breath quickened. He was drowning in the past, unable to move, unable to think. And then Charlie barked. Not the Charlie from his memories. His Charlie, the puppy. The small, scrappy dog lunged forward, snapping at the men's feet, his tiny body shaking with fury.
Whoa, hey!
One of the men stumbled back, laughing.
Little things got a temper.
The distraction was enough. Jack snapped back into the present. His breathing steadied. The shaking in his hands stopped. He wasn't in a war zone. He was here, in this alley with Charlie. And he wouldn't let these men take what little he had. Jack took a step forward.
Leave. Now.
The men hesitated. Maybe they saw the fire in Jack's eyes. Maybe they realized he wasn't as weak as they thought. Or maybe they just weren't looking for a real fight.
Whatever, man.
The leader grumbled, backing off.
Keep your stupid dog.
The others followed him, disappearing into the night, their laughter echoing down the alley. Jack let out a slow breath, his pulse still racing. He crouched down, running his fingers through Charlie's fur.
You're a brave one.
He murmured.
Way too brave for your size.
Charlie wagged his tail, his small body still trembling from the encounter.
Is everything okay?
Jack whipped around, his muscles tensing again. A woman stood a few feet away, holding a bag of groceries. She looked to be in her late 20s, with kind brown eyes and a worried expression. Jack frowned. He wasn't used to people asking if he was okay.
Yeah,
He muttered.
we're fine.
She glanced at the retreating figures of the thugs.
Didn't look fine.
Jack didn't answer. He wasn't in the mood for sympathy. The woman knelt down and reached out her hand. Charlie sniffed her fingers before giving them a tentative lick.
He's adorable.
She said with a small smile.
Is he yours?
Jack hesitated, then nodded.
Yeah.
She looked up at him.
I'm Emily. I work at an animal rescue shelter a few blocks from here.
She glanced at Charlie again, noticing the way he still trembled slightly.
He looks like he could use a warm place for the night.
Jack immediately stiffened.
I don't need charity.
He said quickly. Emily raised an eyebrow.
Who said anything about charity?
She stood, brushing off her jeans.
The shelter isn't just for animals. We help people too. If you come by in the morning, we can give Charlie a checkup. Maybe even get you both some food.
Jack hesitated. He hated relying on people. He had spent too many years being let down, too many years hearing empty promises. But then Charlie nudged his leg with his nose, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Jack sighed. It wasn't about him. It was about Charlie now.
Where is it?
He asked. Emily smiled, pulling a small card from her coat pocket.
3 blocks down, blue building. Just ask for me.
Jack took the card, turning it over in his fingers. Emily looked at him for a moment, then nodded.
See you in the morning, Jack.
He blinked. How did she know his name? She pointed to his coat, where a faded military patch was barely visible beneath the worn fabric.
You were a soldier.
She said softly. Jack didn't reply. She didn't press him. She just gave him one last knowing look before walking away into the night. Jack stared down at Charlie, who wagged his tail expectantly. For the first time in a long time, Jack had somewhere to go in the morning. Jack stood outside the animal shelter, staring at the faded blue door. His fingers tightened around the straps of his worn-out backpack as doubt gnawed at him. He had spent years avoiding places like this. Places that offered help. Help always came with strings attached, or worse, with empty promises. Charlie, tucked under his coat, squirmed slightly, letting out a soft whimper. Jack sighed. This wasn't about him. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The shelter was small but warm. The smell of clean straw, antiseptic, and wet fur filled the air. A few dogs barked from their kennels, tails wagging as they pressed against the fences.
Jack, you came.
Emily appeared from a back room, a welcoming smile on her face. She wasn't surprised, as if she had known all along that he would show up. Jack shrugged.
Charlie needed it.
She nodded.
Come on, let's take a look at him.
Emily led Jack into a small examination room. The walls were lined with charts of dog anatomy, shelves filled with supplies, and a faint scent of disinfectant. A young veterinarian in a white coat entered, introducing herself as Dr. Patel. She gave Charlie a gentle scratch behind the ears before examining him.
He's a tough little guy.
She said with a smile, but her brow furrowed as she inspected his paws and ears.
He has a mild infection, nothing serious, but it could have gotten worse without treatment.
Jack's stomach twisted. Had he failed Charlie already? Dr. Patel must have sensed his worry because she added,
It's treatable. A round of antibiotics, some good nutrition, and he'll be just fine.
She handed Charlie back to Jack, who held him close, feeling the small, warm body pressed against his chest.
How much is this going to cost?
Jack asked, shifting uncomfortably. Emily exchanged a glance with Dr. Patel before answering.
Nothing. We have funds for cases like this.
Jack stiffened.
I don't take handouts.
Emily sighed but didn't push.
Then think of it as a favor to Charlie, not you.
Jack exhaled slowly, his resistance faltering. This wasn't about pride. Charlie needed help. He nodded.
Fine.
As Charlie received his first dose of medication, Emily led Jack to a small break room. She handed him a steaming cup of coffee. Jack hesitated before taking it. The warmth seeped into his fingers, chasing away the lingering chill of the streets.
So,
Emily said, leaning against the table.
how long have you been out here?
Jack frowned, staring into his cup.
A while.
He expected her to pry, to ask the usual questions. What happened? Why are you homeless? Do you have family? But she didn't. She just waited, giving him space. Jack wasn't used to that. After a long silence, he muttered.
Got out of the service. Things didn't go how I thought they would.
Emily nodded, as if she understood more than she let on.
A lot of veterans struggle after coming home.
Jack scoffed.
Struggle is putting it lightly.
He could still hear the gunfire, the shouting, the sound of Charlie's last breath, the real Charlie, the soldier, the brother he lost. Jack took a shaky breath.
It's easy to feel forgotten, like none of it mattered.
Emily's eyes softened.
It mattered, Jack.
His jaw clenched.
If it did, why am I out here?
She didn't have an answer for that. No one ever did. Jack shook his head, setting his coffee down.
Look, I appreciate what you did for Charlie, but I don't belong here.
He stood to leave, but Emily didn't move.
You're wrong.
She said simply. Jack narrowed his eyes.
About what?
She smiled.
About not belonging.
Emily walked over to a nearby kennel where a nervous-looking dog cowered in the corner. It was a thin, shaggy mutt, its ears drooping as it watched them cautiously.
This is Benny,
She said.
He was abandoned. Spent weeks out on the streets, scared and alone.
Jack glanced at the dog. He knew that feeling all too well. Emily crouched down, her voice gentle.
We've been working with him, but he doesn't trust easily.
She turned to Jack.
You know what that's like, don't you?
Jack stiffened.
What are you getting at?
She stood, brushing her hands off.
You have a way with Charlie, and I think you could help here.
Jack let out a humorless laugh.
You want me to work in a shelter?
Just try it.
Emily said.
Help out for a bit. If you hate it, you can walk away.
Jack crossed his arms.
I don't know anything about taking care of animals.
Emily smirked.
You've been taking care of one just fine.
Jack glanced down at Charlie, who wagged his tail. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to start caring about something just to have it taken away. But what was the alternative? Going back to the streets? Sleeping in the cold? Scrounging for food? Waiting for another fight he might not win? Jack exhaled.
What exactly would I have to do?
Emily grinned.
Nothing crazy. Just some light work. Helping clean up, feeding the animals, maybe even helping with the more nervous ones.
Jack eyed Benny, who was watching him with quiet curiosity.
Do I get paid?
He asked. Emily hesitated.
Not much. We don't have a big budget, but there's a small stipend, enough for food and supplies, and you'd have a warm place to be during the day.
Jack shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure how to accept kindness anymore. But then Charlie licked his hand, looking up at him with those trusting eyes. Jack sighed.
Fine, I'll try it. No promises.
Emily beamed.
That's all I as K.
She held out her hand. Jack stared at it for a moment before shaking it. Her grip was firm, grounding, real. Jack wasn't sure where this road would lead, but for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. Jack never thought he'd be here. For years, he had convinced himself that he didn't belong anywhere, that he was nothing more than a forgotten soldier wandering through life, carrying the weight of his past with no real purpose. But now, for the first time in a long time, he had something to wake up for. It had been a few weeks since he started helping at the shelter. His days had a rhythm now, one that didn't involve shivering on a cold sidewalk or wondering where his next meal would come from. Instead, he spent his mornings filling water bowls, cleaning kennels, and feeding the dogs. The work was simple but meaningful. Every wagging tail, every grateful lick, every timid dog that slowly started to trust him, it all made him feel like he was doing something that mattered. Jack stood in the supply room, scooping food into a large metal bowl. Charlie sat at his feet, tail wagging.
You know this isn't for you, right?
Jack smirked as he reached down to scratch behind the puppy's ears. Charlie barked softly as if arguing his case. Jack chuckled, shaking his head.
Nice try, buddy.
He carried the bowl to a kennel where Benny, the shy mutt Emily had introduced him to, waited in the corner.
Hey there, pal.
Jack said gently, setting the food down and backing away. He had learned patience with dogs like Benny. The trick was giving them space, letting them come to you when they were ready. Benny sniffed the air, hesitated, then slowly inched toward the bowl. Jack felt a strange sense of satisfaction watching the dog eat. It reminded him of his own progress. At first, he had been reluctant to accept the shelter's help, just like Benny was wary of people. But little by little, he had started trusting again. Not every day was easy. Some mornings he woke up drenched in sweat, his mind dragged back to the desert, to gunfire and chaos. Other times, a loud noise, a slamming door, a car backfiring, would send a jolt of panic through his chest, his body tense and ready for a fight. But Charlie was always there. Whenever the memories threatened to pull him under, Charlie would press his small body against Jack's leg, grounding him in the present. One night, Jack woke up gasping for air, heart pounding. Charlie whined, nudging his face with his wet nose. Jack let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. He wasn't alone anymore. The realization didn't erase the past, but it made the weight of it a little easier to carry. As the days passed, more people at the shelter started to notice Jack's dedication. Volunteers would leave extra sandwiches or coffee for him, subtly offering kindness without making a big deal out of it, which Jack appreciated. One afternoon, an older man named Frank, who often donated supplies, pulled Jack aside.
"You're good with these dogs,"
Frank said, handing Jack a folded jacket. "Figured you could use something warmer." Jack hesitated, then took it with a nod.
Thanks.
Frank smiled.
"No need to thank me, son. Just glad to see someone getting back on their feet."
Jack wasn't sure how to respond to that. Was he really getting back on his feet? The idea seemed foreign, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel impossible. One morning, Emily walked into the break room with a grin.
You're famous.
She teased, holding up a newspaper. Jack frowned.
What?
She tossed it onto the table. The headline read, "Homeless Veteran Saves Puppy, Finds Redemption Through Rescue Work." Jack's stomach twisted as he saw a photo of himself kneeling beside Charlie.
Who wrote this?
he asked, his voice gruff. Emily shrugged.
A local journalist named Rachel came by last week. She saw you with Charlie, asked about your story. I didn't think you'd mind.
Jack exhaled sharply. He didn't like attention. He had spent years trying to disappear, and now his face was in the paper.
Jack, this is a good thing.
Emily said softly.
People need to hear stories like yours.
Jack shook his head.
I didn't ask for this.
No, but maybe someone out there needed to read it.
She replied.
Maybe there's another vet struggling, thinking he's alone. Maybe this tells him he's not.
Jack stared at the newspaper. He had never thought about it that way. A few days after the article was published, something unexpected happened. People started coming to the shelter, not just to adopt animals, but to talk to Jack. A young man, barely in his 20s, approached him hesitantly.
I read about you in the paper,
He said, shifting awkwardly.
I just got out of the Marines. It's been rough.
Jack studied the kid, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight on his shoulders. For the first time, Jack realized he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, he could help others the way Emily had helped him. Jack wasn't sure what the future held, but as he sat outside the shelter that evening, watching Charlie play in the grass, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Jack never expected his story to spread. At first, it was just a local article, a small piece about a homeless veteran and the puppy that changed his life. But within days, it was everywhere. Emily showed him the online post on her phone.
You've gone viral, Jack.
She said with a grin. Jack frowned, squinting at the screen.
What does that even mean?
It means thousands of people have read your story.
She explained.
And they're inspired.
Jack didn't know how to feel about that. He wasn't trying to be an inspiration, but the emails and messages that started flooding in told him otherwise. The article made its way onto social media, and soon people from all over the country were reaching out. Messages from fellow veterans, animal lovers, and strangers who simply wanted to help poured in. A man from Texas wrote,
I was in the same place you were, brother. Seeing your story gave me hope.
a woman from California sent,
Your kindness toward Charlie reminded me there's still good in the world.
and then there were the donations. Emily pulled him aside one day, holding a printed report.
People are sending money to help you, Jack.
Jack stiffened.
I don't need charity.
Emily gave him a knowing look.
It's not charity, it's gratitude.
Jack wasn't sure what to do with that. He had spent so long believing he didn't deserve help, but now people were offering it anyway. And maybe for the first time, he was ready to accept it. Jack was cleaning out a kennel when Emily approached him, her face unreadable.
There's someone here to see you.
She said carefully. Jack frowned.
Who?
She hesitated, then stepped aside, and there she was. Lisa. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His younger sister, the one he hadn't seen in over a decade. The years had changed her. Lines of worry creased her face, but her eyes were the same, wide, full of emotion.
Jack.
She whispered. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping the kennel door. He had thought about this moment so many times, but never believed it would actually happen. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes welling with tears.
I read about you in the paper. I couldn't believe it. I had to come.
Jack felt a lump form in his throat. What was he supposed to say?
I thought you didn't want to see me.
He muttered. Lisa shook her head fiercely.
I never stopped wanting to see you. I didn't know how to find you. After Mom died, you disappeared.
Jack looked away. He had disappeared on purpose. Lisa reached for his hand.
You don't have to be alone anymore, Jack.
Something inside him cracked. He had spent years believing he was unwanted, forgotten. But maybe he had been wrong. With a shaky breath, he pulled his sister into a hug. For the first time in a long time, he let himself be someone's brother again. A week later, Emily approached Jack with a bittersweet smile.
There's a family interested in Charlie.
She said gently. Jack froze. His heart clenched in his chest. A family, a real home. That's what Charlie deserved, right? The couple arrived that afternoon, a kind-looking husband and wife with 2 kids, eager to meet the little dog who had stolen so many hearts. Charlie wagged his tail as they kneeled to pet him, licking their hands. The little girl giggled.
He's perfect.
Jack forced a smile.
Yeah, he is.
But something inside him felt wrong. Emily must have noticed.
Jack,
She said softly.
you don't have to do this.
Jack looked at Charlie, who trotted over and pressed his small body against Jack's leg. Charlie had saved him. He couldn't imagine life without him now. With a deep breath, Jack turned to the family.
I'm really sorry,
He said, rubbing the back of his neck.
but I can't let him go.
The couple exchanged understanding smiles.
I don't think he wants to leave you either.
The husband said. Jack let out a breath of relief. That night, as he sat with Charlie curled up beside him, he whispered,
Guess you're stuck with me, buddy.
Charlie licked his hand in response. Thanks to the donations and growing support from the community, Jack was finally able to take the next step. Emily helped him secure a full-time job at the shelter, and Frank, the older man who had once given him a jacket, helped him find a small apartment nearby. It wasn't much, a simple one-bedroom space with old furniture and a leaky faucet, but it was his. Jack stood in the doorway, taking it all in. A real home. Charlie trotted inside, sniffing every corner before jumping onto the couch. He wagged his tail, as if giving his approval. Jack chuckled.
Yeah, I think we'll be all right here.
One evening, Jack sat on a park bench, watching Charlie chase leaves in the autumn breeze. The air was crisp, but for the first time in years, he wasn't cold. He wasn't alone. He thought about how much had changed since that night in the alley, the night he gave away his last piece of bread to a shivering puppy. A single act of kindness. That's all it had been. But somehow that moment had set off a chain reaction, one that had led him here. He reached down, scratching behind Charlie's ears.
You saved me, you know that?
He murmured. Charlie barked, licking his hand. Jack smiled, staring at the city skyline. Maybe he had been lost once, but now he had found his way home.